Yet another depressing tragedy, major changes to character backstories, and the arrival of our chubby big boys. Another week, another great one. Today I'm back to recap episode 5 of The Last of Us and talk about all the smaller details you might have missed, game parallels, and behind the scenes information. There are no future spoilers in this one, so if this is your first venture into the world of The Last of Us, fret not, as you are in safe territory. We opened the episode by going back in time and seeing the huge rebellion and the hunters taking over Kansas. Craig here talks about how this was just another case of grounding the violence we'd be seeing. In the game, we only ever see the aftermath of these sorts of things, but here, we actually get a solid glimpse of exactly how that went down, which just really helps sell the brutal methods of Kathleen we'd see later in the episode. On the flip side, we then see Henry and Sam sneaking around, which already marks big change numero 2 as we see that Sam in the TV version is deaf. This is of course a pretty major character change from the game where, well, he wasn't deaf. Craig explained the change saying that they just didn't want to repeat the same communication we see with Joel and Ellie. Clearly, both Henry and Joel have that paternal bond with Sam and Ellie. So if Henry were to just be a protective older brother as he is in the game, we'd be retreading the same story beats. And you know...
Yeah, it's not great.
In the game, we never leave Joel and Ellie, and so we don't get this personal look into how Henry and Sam survive. So there simply is no need to change it up. Their bond can be exactly the same as Joel and Ellie's because we don't focus on them. And considering it both allows for these slow and literally quiet scenes, as well as sound and being as quiet as possible playing a huge role in The Last of Us, I think the change actually works really well. Neil actually said that he was angry about the change because he hadn't thought of it when working on the game, so that's pretty fun. Though another fun fact here is that as much as both Craig and Neil loved the idea, it almost didn't happen because of how specific the casting call was. Apparently, it was so difficult that he just ended up putting out a tweet and hoping someone would find someone. But even after that, literally only 5 people showed up. Luckily though, they ended up finding Kevin, who was just perfect in the role. Anyway, in story, we then see Kathleen talk to the people who snitched others to Fedra. Again, it just cements that she is absolutely ruthless, and it also immediately plants the idea in your mind that she has a zero-tolerance policy toward these sorts of transgressions, which is a particularly big problem since Henry would also reveal that he ratted someone out.
When you're done, burn the bodies. It's faster.
As for Henry and Sam, we see them meet up with Edelstein and hold up in the attic which we saw Kathleen's people raid last episode. Though what I think has to be the absolute best part here is Henry telling Sam, which is of course an exact mirroring of,
No one's gonna find us.
Judging by the end of the episode, those tragic parallels are probably crystal clear, with them very much being found just like they feared. Though a super small detail that I thought was really neat here is the depiction of hangriness. When we see Sam talking about how he's hungry and asking whether Edelstein would come back, he's clearly ticked off because they're starving. So from a realism perspective, I just thought it was a really nice touch. Though as they realize that Edelstein isn't coming back and they are completely out of food, they decide that it's time to flee, and we then see Joel's fight from the previous episode from their perspective. Again, none of this pre-meeting stuff happens in the game, so we never get this angle of Henry realizing that Joel's strength could actually get them out. Which brings us on to the conclusion of the previous episode and them actually meeting up, with both Joel and Ellie being held up at gunpoint in the middle of the night. In the game, Joel and Ellie run into Henry and Sam purely by accident. They're just sneaking around the city and trying to escape the hunters, but as they hop a window, Joel is suddenly grabbed from behind by Henry, and that is that. Joel, of course, then becomes a Giga Chad and begins beating him on the floor until Sam pops up and holds them at gunpoint. At which point, Henry realizes that with Ellie by his side, Joel clearly isn't one of the hunters. So backstory-wise, in the game, Henry and Sam just so happen to get caught up with the hunters after they came into the city with their survivor group, who have all either died or have gone missing. In the show, on the other hand, it is of course Sam's leukemia and Henry getting medicine for him that sparked this entire hunt. Though more on that in just a second. And while their backstories may differ, in both versions it's just a case of getting out of the city, and so they all team up. But another change here is the depiction of their morality. As in the show, Henry blatantly says that he has never harmed anyone, saying that the closest thing to violence he's done is holding up the duo with the empty guns. This would of course turn out to be a lie, but the implication of him not being a violent person clearly still stands. In the game, on the other hand, we once again have the question of game mechanics. Henry was supposed to be a sidekick for a while, so he needs to be able to fight by default. So the way that morality was depicted was with him telling Sam off for trying to steal a toy, saying that they just take what they need. Obviously in the apocalypse, such a belief is pretty absurd, but it does convey his morality. I think this is just another case of the show grounding the violence that basically becomes background noise in the game. And just like we've talked about already, both Joel and Henry have to fight off a couple more small armies together that is clearly not a thing in the show. As for Sam and Ellie, just like the game, they hit it off right away. Though a change for the show is that Sam is made younger, as in the game he was 13, just a year younger than Ellie. Craig here says that they just like the idea of having a character who looks up to Ellie in the same way she looks up to Joel, and this was just a nice opportunity for that. So that relatability of being roughly the same age from the games is just swapped out for this inspiration and a bit of an idol in Ellie. As for their journey together, I don't want to get too deep into it out of fear of spoilers, as the show has chosen to adapt some things out of order here and there, but in the game, it is not as simple as them just dipping into the tunnels, and they share a few more adventures together through all kinds of environments. And of course, they also fight off a few more dozen people. Though the tunnel sequence itself is relatively faithful, with the only big exception being that, again, because it had to have some gameplay, they also fight off a whole bunch of infected. In the show, we then see them stumble upon this underground settlement, which both functions as a bit of a breather, as well as further expands on Henry's story. First off, the whole environmental storytelling here was super interesting, and I think it really captured that exploration vibe of the game really well in my opinion. This is by no means exclusive to The Last of Us, but obviously in games you'll find these notes scattered around the place which often hold crucial lore information, and I think those drawings of Ish were just that. In the game, you can piece together Ish's story through the notes you gather, from his appearance to the gear he wears, etc, etc. And side note, the character of Ish is actually another reference to Isherwood Williams in the post-apocalyptic novel Earth Abides, where Williams also establishes a community for survivors of a pandemic. But that's an entirely different rabbit hole to go down, and I'm sure somebody has already explored the backstory of Ish pretty in-depth already here on YouTube. Though Craig also mentions that this was a big focus for them, saying that they could have easily done an entire standalone-ish episode, but they just decided to sort of tip their hats to the more subtle game lore and have the environment do the storytelling. As for the story, here we of course finally learn why Kathleen is so focused on going after Henry. He had in fact lied to Joel about not killing anyone, revealing that he killed Kathleen's brother to get medicine for Sam. Like I mentioned before, this is a departure from the game, but I think it just furthers that conversation of, why do you get to kill in the name of survival, but I don't? That is obviously a constant throughline in The Last of Us, and we'll see that plenty more in the future, but for now, just hold that thought for a moment. We then cut to Kathleen, where we get a whole bunch of super interesting scenes. Again, Kathleen does not exist in the game, so everything here is 100% new. In the game, literally all the hunters are just faceless baddies. Though the super interesting thing here is the brief conversation we see between Perry, who I'll desperately try to avoid calling Tommy because he is Tommy's voice actor in the games, and Kathleen. Obviously, the expectation here is that you'd expect Perry to call Kathleen out, with even her herself explicitly stating that she knows she should forgive. But that is then completely subverted, because while Perry does question her, he ultimately says he understands. And as if that wasn't enough, even goes as far as to say,
"Your brother was a great man, but he didn't change anything. You did."
Clearly showcasing complete and total loyalty. And again, clearly Kathleen is poised as the ultimate baddie. I mean, she is absolutely cutthroat, right? But at the same time, that obsession of hers to go after her brother's killer isn't entirely out of the range of possibility for even someone like Joel, is it? I mean, it's a classic revenge plot, right? Wonder if that'll go anywhere. Troy here mentions an interesting parallel in that sense, saying that this episode is actually constantly mirroring Joel and Ellie. Kathleen has that obsession with protecting her own, one that is clearly shared by Joel. And on the flip side, Sam and Henry clearly represent that parental bond between the duo. Returning to Joel's group, we see Ellie basically offer Henry and Sam to tag along with them, and of course, we also see her already making fun of Joel for being grumpy and disagreeable.
He's like, no, Ellie, never, ever, ever happening.
Though then suddenly, they are shot at by a sniper. In the game, this happens during the daytime, and again, they have traveled what at least feels to be a lot further. On top of that, because this is again an entire gameplay section, it's not just a single sniper at the end of the road. It is a yet another small army which we have to fight our way through. And when we make it to the house, because you've already Rambo'd your way there, the whole final battle with the sniper is also a lot more high octane and fueled by rage. In the show, on the other hand, this entire thing is far more depressing. Because as Joel sneaks into the house, he sees this lone old man whose aim was never even good enough to get them anyway. And as Joel tells him to just drop the gun and let them escape, he of course decides that he'll go out here and now and just starts to snap around. At which point, he is immediately shot. Craig here talks about how they could have adapted the huge action sequence we see in the game. But frankly, they wouldn't have ever been able to replicate that intensity of you playing it through yourself, and watching people just duck and shoot just wouldn't feel the same. It wasn't a case of subverting expectations, but rather changing the sequence to switch from action to just sheer sadness. The sniper has terrible aim, he's an old man sitting in the dark, and he's alone. Joel here just begs for him to stop and let them go, but he snaps, obviously implying that this was his way of going out. He doesn't constantly antagonize you like in the game, this is just an old man wanting it to be over. So that action, as with many scenes thus far, is replaced by a more down-to-earth and, again, frankly depressing realization of some people are just sick of surviving. Though of course, Kathleen then arrives and that ruthlessness is once again on full display as she asks, "Why does your kid matter? Kids die all the time." Which again, is clearly absolutely brutal on the face of it, but it also does continue that morality debate of, is anyone in this world really in the right? Everyone is fighting for someone. Literally in episode 1, Joel already rode past people on the road. So again, it just brings up that question of, why do your ends justify the means, but mine don't? But to be totally honest, this is the first scene thus far that I do think could have been slightly less traumatized. As to me, it did feel a little bit like bad guy delivers monologue, everyone stand back and wait. Whereas the rest of the series has always attempted to remain grounded in reality where we don't have these dramatic pauses. But whatever the case, before they can do anything, the car begins falling into that sinkhole thingy and we hear the infected begin to moan. And moments later, we see a frankly ridiculous number of infected come bolting out of the ground. And I think to everyone who thought we hadn't seen enough infected thus far, I think this is exactly why. That payoff of just going from 0 to 100 in a literal split moment just felt so incredibly tense. Regarding the Horde being underground though, Craig here talks about how the whole plan of going underground in the first place was to set up a bit of a subversion with how smooth it went. Obviously, the first time we hear Henry talking about how he heard it's clean, you fully expect, sure, it'll go smooth at first, but sooner or later, it'll all go wrong, right? But no, when we go through there, he was right, it is 100% clean. That is, of course, until the end of the episode, where we don't find some infected underground. We find literally all the infected underground. And very fittingly, Craig also mentions that the inspiration here were ant colonies and how they tend to just pour out like a volcano. Though, it of course does not end there, because finally, our Chonky boy also makes his entrance, and so we have our first Bloater. First off, in the game, we actually encounter our first Bloater alongside Bill while scavenging, something that obviously never happened in the show. Though secondly, the Bloater as a concept is also sort of remixed from the game. If you remember episode 2, there Ellie said,
"So there aren't super infected that explode fungus spores on you?"
Which I took to be very clever foreshadowing toward a Bloater as, in the game, it also fires these exploding fungus balls at you. Whereas the show chose to focus on just the absurdly powerful nature of it. But who knows, maybe Ellie's description will turn out to be right after all. Craig and Neil also talk about how there was a huge split in opinion whether the show should even have bloaters at all. In the game, when you see it, clearly this is just an enemy to kill. You get your nail bombs, molotovs, and just go ham on it. But in the show, they thought about how having this absolute beast of a creature might be far more interesting if you have no chance of killing it. And so, when we literally see it throw people around one-handed, the only thought in your mind is, run. Which I think was a really nice way of going about it in the show. Honestly, I'm just really hoping that we actually get to see more of them, as I think having this sort of chasing force is just super neat. Oh, and the last thing we see here is of course some poetic justice, as Kathleen is absolutely destroyed by a clicker that just so happens to be a kid. See, Kathleen? That's why you don't mess around with children. Jokes aside though, that contortionist's performance was literally the stuff of nightmares, so I think that was a really great addition. And the very final scenes of the episode converge right back to the game. The group just chill out and talk about what they'll be getting into next. During this exchange, Joel and Henry also talk about the whole endure and survive saying that has become a staple for the Last of Us community. And funnily enough, Neil here talks about how this poking fun at it by Joel is because it was sort of accidental and meant to be cheesy. Apparently he wanted a Watchmen-like reference, and since The Last of Us is set in a post-apocalyptic world, he straight up thesaurused the word survive and just found endure and survive. I don't think it being a bit of a meme detracts from the line in any way, but I do admit, I did get a very good chuckle out of them calling it out as redundant. But we then cut to Ellie and Sam, and things very quickly take a turn. First off, Ellie saying, "I'm scared all the time of ending up alone," already begins to hint at the reason why she gets so attached to people and why she admires Joel so much, but no spoilers. All I'll say here is that I am not emotionally ready for that line about everyone she knows that she says. If you know, you know. The scene of Ellie telling Sam that her blood is medicine is another add-in for the show, and I think captured that childlike ignorance extremely well. And I know there will be very silly people who will say that, oh, what they did was extremely stupid, and yes it was. They are children. Yes, Ellie could have gotten bit. Yes, Ellie could have died. That is the point. Clearly this is just denial and nothing more. In the game, Sam turned overnight, and so when Ellie opens the doors, that's when he pops out. But in the show, he of course lunges on top of Ellie when she pokes him in the morning, and we then get another case of the show replicating the game effectively beat for beat. Henry is clearly in complete and utter shock as he first threatens Joel, then snaps to Sam, then right back to Joel, but then he ultimately goes and shoots Sam, freeing Ellie. But before Joel can talk him down, he turns the gun on himself and... Yep, that is The Last of Us, and unfortunately, Henry's promise of no one finding them turned out to be a lie. And yet again, Joel witnessed the death of a child right in front of his eyes, something he swore he would never see again. This is one of those moments that I think everyone who had played the game was absolutely dreading, because just when we thought we made it out, nope. And obviously, with Sam being just a kid, that just hurts so much more. But as far as adapting that for the show, yet again, I think everyone involved absolutely knocked it out of the park. And I, for one, cannot wait to see where we go from here. Though yes, that is episode 5. Another week, another tragedy. It's crazy to me how well they've managed to incorporate these shorter stories from the game and spin them into something entirely new. And I guess, speaking of which, I also find it odd how people have expressed criticisms about Kathleen's group and how they're supposedly not interesting enough, when in reality, we have gained infinitely more insight into how they operate, what they do, and their motivations. But whatever the case, the preview for the next episode showed us snow, so prepare for me to talk about that for about 5 years. But I hope to see you back next week as we enter the next major chapter of the story. And that's the video. Like I think I've said a million times by now, I think this was another perfect episode, but I hope this video will at least help tide you over until the weekend. But with that said, I want to say a massive thank you to our current patrons and YouTube members who allow me to produce even more of these for you all. Without you, there'd be a whole lot less of my ramblings, so seriously, thank you. Other than that, I want to say thank you very much for watching, I hope you have a great day, and hopefully, I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.